Hello, good afternoon, good morning, good evening, wherever you may be tuning in from. Welcome to episode 124 of Veeam Industry Insights. Now, just going on a little over 3 years. This is going to conclude our research recap on data protection trends 2023, our 12th episode in the series, breaking down data protection trends research. Today's episode is entitled Containers Aren't Near, They Are Here. And to help join me riff on this is an expert in the field. Welcome, please, Matt Bator. Matt, thanks for joining us. It's nice to see somebody also has no idea what to do with their extra money. In the background, we've got Matt framed up pretty tightly and crisply, but he's got, how many bike frames do you have back there?
Just in the room, 7. I've got my trainer bike over there. This office is actually right over my garage, where my wife has forbidden me from acquiring any more. We are on a one in, one out policy. So
Nice. So the way I solved that is I just started tilting the guitars at an angle, so it makes it easier to get more of them on that one wall, because I am limited to a one wall policy, except for the acoustics, which are over there. But Matt, I want to break down some things with you. We've got some data points, as I mentioned from the outset. One of the things that we've done for those that aren't familiar with some of the research that Jason Buffington and I often break down, this data protection trends report that we've talked about for the third year in a row, it's the largest independent research in the history of backup and recovery. It's not just Veeam customers. In fact, of the 4,200 respondents max for some of the questions, only about 7%, Matt, were Veeam customers. And then we branched down specific paths. So I'll share a couple of results on the screen here shortly, but we'll subset down from 4,000 to 200 to just under a couple thousand, because we made sure people were pre-qualified to answer, in this case, what is your usage of containers? So without further ado, I kind of want to break into the punchline. And this really, Matt, is the whole reason why I entitled the episode the way I did. Gaurav Rishi is the product management expert over in Kasten, Veeam's Kubernetes solution, likes to say, depending on how you want to count, containers and Kubernetes are a half a decade old to half a decade young. A lot of times when I talk to what I'll call the more traditional backup specialist, meaning the traditional Veeam admin, their view is containers are on the horizon. What the data is telling us here, and just love to get your view on it, I'm a big fan of boundary conditions. Only 1% right at kind of 12 o'clock there said they have no plans to run containers. Going counterclockwise, 8% said, well, we're not in deployment yet, but we're planning. And you see, kind of go around, I'll jump. Over half, 52%, say they're already in production. Doesn't mean their entire environment is that way, but over half say they've got containers somewhere in production. And 40% said we're not in production, but we're planning to. That's a pretty staggering amount. Did any of that surprise you from around 2,100 respondents globally?
honestly, no. I mean, from an operations perspective, we think about containers as being a somewhat newer technology, but you could go now all the way back to the early 2010s when and I mean, certainly Linux container technology predates plenty of that, but early 2010s was where we saw really the introduction of Docker that really popularized the use of containers for the developer persona. And that's where we saw a lot of this take root, because it was, a solution very much targeted at their needs as, monolithic applications become more and more difficult to maintain with larger and larger teams. And looking at the rise of SaaS applications and massive scale of some of these things, we needed a different model to build applications in the first place, and that was this, move towards microservices to allow, more and more development teams to work efficiently on the same product. Basically, again, getting you updates, getting you new features to market faster, getting a more consistent deployment experience. No more like, well, it worked on my machine type of mentality towards deploying code. Um, it's it's a no-brainer that from that perspective, it's really taken root across a number of different organizations. Um, and I think where we've kind of come from a maturity perspective with this is, okay, how do we take this from a tool that just makes development easier to then, how does this fit into the more mature model of IT operations, and how does it get applied to deployment and done so efficiently, done so at scale? That's where I'm sure we'll get into this. We get into the rise of container orchestration and Kubernetes, where that's taken hold. But containers as a blanket technology, this doesn't surprise me at all. Those 40% that again are using container technology in their environments today, but not in production. That's it. Like, they're still trying to solve that problem of how do we take this great experience for our developers and apply this to operations as well.
Yeah, great points. And I should mention, for those of you math whizzes out there, you'll notice due to rounding, if you go around the wheel there, the circular readout, it actually adds up to 101%. That's just a rounding notion. That's why we're a little bit off. The other thing I'll quickly point out is the QR codes. The QR code kind of in the lower left-hand side is information about Kasten, the K10 product that's Kubernetes native and Kubernetes specific from a backup and recovery perspective, disaster recovery, and an application mobility and deployment perspective. The QR code in the upper right-hand side, that is related to the overall data protection trends report. If you're not comfortable clicking QR codes, in the very bottom lower left, we also have the small URL, VEE.am/DPR23. That just means Data Protection Trends 23. But, Matt, what I want to do, and thank you for that great backgrounder, let's continue doing some myth busting. So maybe myth number one, we've already busted, which is containers are coming in a few years, when the reality is somewhere in your environment, if you're like the average organization, there's been some amount of containers already in production for a few years. The infrastructure operations team just may not have been aware of it. The next myth, and I appreciate this looks like an eye chart, we'll decompose it for you. But Matt, the myth right off the bat is containers are for big shops, meaning large scale enterprises. And this is just, believe it or not, the same exact data that circular ring is showing. It's just breaking it down by company size as counting employees. So the left-hand bar is for organizations typically classified as small, medium business, less than 250 employees. The middle band is 250 to 999 employees. And then the right-hand band is if you have 1,000 employees and above, that's where Gartner and IDC typically say that's a definition of an enterprise. The color coding, exactly the same. Green, you're in production at the bottom. That kind of darker green stack there that you're not in production, but you're looking at it. Gray is not deployed or not yet deployed, but you're interested in it. And then the top bar kind of in the orange is no plans. So I'll give you first word on this. What does this distribution say to you? Is it surprising in any way, or is it what you expected?
Uh, Again, it's becoming less and less about size of the organization for sure. Certainly not just specific to the enterprise. may make the most sense there. Public sector also, I see a lot of adoption of Kubernetes. And again, it goes back to the why of Kubernetes and containerization in the first place. And a lot of it is just, it's reduction in operational costs. One, stat that I talk about on a somewhat regular basis outside of this Veeam study was from it was a Forrester Total Economic Impact report on OpenShift, Red Hat OpenShift, earlier this year. That across the board, what they were seeing was a 50 to 60% reduction in operational costs in environments in different business sizes in moving to OpenShift. But I think the more important piece coming out of that was the 2 to 3x acceleration in timeline for delivering new applications, right? So that's why, regardless of if I'm a very small organization or a very large organization, time to market is a competitive advantage, right? And realistically, it's getting easier for smaller organizations to adopt Kubernetes. One of the other related shifts we're seeing this year, Dynatrace had just recently released their it's called the Kubernetes in the Wild report for 2023. And this is based on literally the billions of pods that they're monitoring across the Dynatrace platform, that's showing a decrease in on-prem Kubernetes in environments. So that was last year a pretty even split. But going from 2022 to 2023, cloud hosted Kubernetes environments, so managed service environments, things like Amazon EKS, Azure Kubernetes service, Google Kubernetes Engine, etc. They're growing 5 times faster than on-prem Kubernetes environments. That is a staggering figure, and it's because again, it's removing some of these operational headaches out of adopting Kubernetes. So your focus as an organization is above the so-called value line, right? So I'm looking at what are the things I need to spend time on to enhance the services or the applications I'm delivering. So yeah, whether we're talking about very, very large or considerably smaller, I think it's more about the application, and does the scale and complexity of that application warrant moving to containers? And if so, then yes, it could be managed by a very, very small team or within a much larger organization.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that the deployment breakdown or shift, because I was familiar with that kind of roughly half and half, meaning half on-prem, half cloud, but it doesn't sound like necessarily a surprise that directionally is more cloud activity taking place, but interesting that the velocity is such that it is. So want to have you walk us through this, because now, the point on the first little bit of info was really to try to reach out and say, look, here are proof points that this is happening. It's not theoretical. But now let's take a step back. Maybe just break this down for us around the evolution of Kubernetes.
Yeah, absolutely. So as Kubernetes as a whole has become less what I would call developer owned within an organization, and the shift is moving more towards operations owned. Operations cares a lot about compliance, reporting, all of the very exciting things that keep us up at night. Backup is a big part of this, and it's relevant ultimately because stateful workloads are becoming more prevalent on Kubernetes. And I still hear on a regular basis from people, well, Matt, Kubernetes is just for stateless workloads. And that's one thing I try and break down. And I'm certainly no PowerPoint wizard, but in this slide is just showing some of the key milestones. So now we're talking about 8 years on almost from the original sort of introduction of Kubernetes 1.0 from born from Google's Borg product. And yeah, 8 years ago, absolutely. Kubernetes was a platform for what I described there as cattle workloads. Um, but from that, from the very beginning, we see this sort of rapid iteration on adding functionality to the platform to run stateful workloads. So pet sets, literally the opposite of cattle there, was first introduced less than a year later. And this became sort of the precursor to what we now know as stateful sets in Kubernetes. This was a primitive that again gave us more control over scaling out stateful workloads and maintaining some aspects of their identity. But the other big sort of milestones we see here, so the CSI, or Container Storage Interface, general availability. So this is now going back 5 years ago. Up until that point, storage support in Kubernetes was what we called in tree, in that the available storage providers, that code was and still exists today, baked into the Kubernetes release itself. So you're talking about your large cloud providers like AWS, Azure, etc. There was built-in vSphere support from very early on, but that's not a scalable model when we think about all of the different storage vendors that we work with, all of the different storage vendors that a customer might have deployed in their environment. So CSI was this plugin model to allow organizations to write their own storage plugins against a standard to easily provide persistent storage into Kubernetes. So from there until now, there are north of 110, 115 production ready storage drivers, CSI drivers for Kubernetes. And then one of the other sort of big pieces that leads into backup and recovery is adding to that CSI specification volume snapshots. So again, how do I have a programmatic way of doing this consistently across, whether I'm using HPE storage, whether I'm using, Elastic Block Store in AWS, that same approach can be followed. So a lot of big enhancements there to just how storage behaves, how easy it's become to consume in Kubernetes, and then other pieces like the operator framework. Again, back on that 2018 marker, this was something developed by Red Hat to make it easier to not just deploy workloads into Kubernetes, but really manage their entire lifecycle. So doing things like upgrading or scaling for very complex workloads. So if I want to make it easy for a developer to deploy a highly available sharded MongoDB database, that might be something in the vSphere world or the bare metal world could be days, weeks to get up and running with all of these sort of built-in best practices. And in the Kubernetes world with operators, that became a point and click operation for the teams that are now building these microservice based apps. So if it's easy for them to consume, now I need the infrastructure to support this, but now I need operations to be responsible for it. And just looking at the bottom there, again, this is going back now 8 years. We see basically for the last 3+ years, we've had all of the functionality within Kubernetes to reliably support these stateful workloads. And most organizations have only started deploying Kubernetes or deploying Kubernetes in production in the last 2 years. So I think this reputation, we could call it, of Kubernetes is only for stateless workloads will eventually phase itself out. But I do love the opportunity to climb up on a soapbox and walk through the why.
Yeah, absolutely. And while some of the earlier demographic information in terms of usage implies that hey, it's really happening, I love the 86% that says, yeah, it's really happening, but it only just started to take off dramatically. So, don't feel like you're being left behind, but at the same time, don't feel like this isn't something that's in the horizon. It is happening now. But let's myth bust, which you verbally did, but let's do, kind of double click on that because I feel like, Matt, when I first heard about Kubernetes, it sounded like you quite literally had to be the Google data center and applications and workloads were going to have a half-life measured in seconds. I mean, it just sounded like such a futuristic or very specialized environment that made people like me that kind of grew up in more traditional infrastructure and operations teams think, well, maybe this isn't, applicable to my environment. But why don't you double click on myth busting the notion of stateless?
Yeah. So, and as I had mentioned before, it really does all come down to the application, right? If I've got something that's very simple, accessed by very few users, I never really have to think about the scaling of this thing. Then is a microservices based architecture in overkill for that application? Probably. I mean, this is a matter of design patterns, right? And certainly we're going to see Kubernetes, coexist alongside virtualization, alongside bare metal workloads for a very, very long time, and potentially whatever comes after Kubernetes. But for again these workloads where I've got especially this notion of what we call polyglot persistence, which is a very fancy way of saying I've got dedicated databases for different parts of my application. NoSQL databases are better at certain things than relational databases are better at different things than time series databases. So this is, as we start to look at building these applications, I want to start mixing and matching the right parts, the right pieces and components, especially within the open source community that I might need to sort of optimize for my apps. And as we can see here from this Datadog data again, which is not survey data, this is real world what they see from their own monitoring. Consumption of these are off the shelf container images, right? So this is not representative of the world at large, but I think it's just a good data point on a lot of the most common off the shelf container images that they see being used are inherently stateful. So we see Postgres, Elasticsearch, Mongo, MySQL, all databases, right? And then we've got things like Redis from a caching perspective, or Kafka or RabbitMQ doing data streaming or message queues. That these have stateful components on the cluster associated with them as well. And I mean, ultimately, the reason why is if I'm maintaining the state of my application outside of the cluster, if it's just connecting to some massive legacy external database, running on Big Iron or running in a VM, I'm not really taking the most advantage of what Kubernetes might have to offer me in terms of ease of deployment, in terms of scaling and high availability, because I'm basically having to maintain this whole separate set of processes for monitoring, performance configuration management, load balancing, you name it. Whereas if I take advantage of these persistent storage and stateful workload features of the platform and go all in, I guess, with putting your stateful workloads on Kubernetes, you have the most to reap from an operational perspective. So all of this comes back to like, how do we save money by building smarter applications, right?
Excellent, excellent. So hit everyone with a couple last data points here, going back to the data protection trend survey. So we asked at first, who is responsible for defining data protection requirements in your organization for containerized applications? Now you alluded to it, but early on in every technology, you tend to get a variety of roles. I think is interesting about this is it's a pretty clean, almost one quarter, one quarter, one quarter, and one quarter split. On the one hand side, you've got the more traditional infrastructure operations teams, meaning the storage admins doing something at the array level, the backup team doing something. At the bottom half there, you've got the application teams, either the Kubernetes administrators or the application admins. Before I go to the next data point, though, I'd love to get your thought on if you were just to prognosticate a couple years from now, what do you think this roughly even mix might look like?
They're all going to continue to have a role to play, but it's important to recognize that there are different personas and make sure that each one has the interfaces they need, has the reporting they need, has the the role-based access control to make sure they can only do the things that they should be able to do. I don't want developers going in and deleting my production backup data because we've only got the because some products might only have the, well, you can do everything, or you can view a configuration and that's it, right? Like that's not the right answer at scale. Certainly
Right.
not when dealing with all of these.
Really quickly, our last data point, how organizations are protecting containers. You see roughly half, 47%, are doing it at the storage array level. They're capturing the blocks. Roughly a little less than a quarter, 22%, they're doing it at the database level. Matt, I would say that roughly 26%, I like that answer better. They're using an integrated third-party solution, purpose-built for container protection. Then you can see that the notion of 1% don't think it's needs to be backed up. It's natively durable. 4% saying it's stateful, which, as we've seen, may not be the case. So, Matt, thank you so much for joining us. Coming up next week, we're going to have David Cerf from Grow Data talking about a really interesting companion solution to Veeam called Blocky to help make your Windows repositories immutable. But more great stuff coming up because in just a few weeks, we're going to have Veeam On coming back a live in-person event. It's going to be in Miami. Again, we were there just a few years back, but we're returning to Miami for Veeam On 2023, and we've got a discount code for you that will scroll by if you want to attend in person. The discount code is VO, the word Miami or the city Miami, 1001. That just means Veeam On Miami 1001. That's a 10% off discount code to join us live. It's a hybrid event, as a lot of them are now. Matt, you can freely join for no charge. We had 14,000 people join us remotely last year when we were in Las Vegas. But we're going to run you a little video to see if you only tune in remotely, what you miss if you don't join us live. Thanks for joining, everyone.